Hello and welcome, and good to have you back as we're continuing this theme of looking at the question: Are the shepherds for sale? And you might remember that what kicked this off was I saw some articles and a particular book that made the claim from a US context that quote the shepherds are for sale. That was the title of the book, and the sort of the strapline to that was something along the lines of. That the evangelical church had sold out the truth for a left-wing agenda. And I picked up on it because people were also asking the question saying, is this applicable to the United Kingdom as well? Now, of course, that presumed that the premise stated in that book by Megan Basham was correct, that the US evangelical church had sold out on the truth for a left-wing agenda. All sorts of questions rising from that, and I noted that people in the States had even challenged the factual claims in her book. People had said that what she had written and said about themselves, about them, was not true, which is very difficult when somebody is claiming that others have sold out on the truth, and those people say, but you aren't actually telling the truth about me. But there seemed to be this broader sense in the United States that there was what was labelled a left-wing agenda, a political agenda that was in competition and rivalry with the church, with the gospel. And underpinning that seemed to be a sense that if there was a political agenda that fitted better with the church, it was, in fact, a conservative, a right-wing agenda. Well, I've I've written about that. I've talked about that, but I said that I wanted to pick up on some examples of the where the conflict, where the touch points seem to be here in the United Kingdom, and I'm picking up on four. There are more that I could pick up on, but I've picked up on COVID. I've picked up on the issue of abortion and some controversies around that. And I'm in a later video. I'm going to talk about men and women, their role in the family, their role in the church, particularly the sort of the complementarianism and egalitarianism debate, and the question about whether those that hold to an egalitarian position are allowing themselves to be conformed by the sort of the contemporary liberal culture around. Are they surrendering to feminism? I guess is the question. And I will be speaking to somebody who is a complementarian, to just to make that clear. But I will be looking at that in another video. But today I wanted to talk a bit about immigration. You see, and I'm not going to be able to say everything that there is to say about the topic here, but I have written quite a bit on faith roots. I've spoken about it. I've talked about some of the issues around on videos as well, arising out of the fact that my ministry experience, in fact, my whole life experience, has been in a multicultural context. So I grew up in Bradford. The part of Bradford I lived in, South Bradford, was mainly made up of council estates. We lived in a small private estate right in the middle, sort of the intersection of those council estates, a little working class community, primarily white. That has changed significantly in I realise it's about 30 years since I left Bradford, though it's still probably more reflects more of a white working class sort of environment than other parts of that city. But I went to school, and the sort of catchment area the school drew on meant that a substantial proportion of the people I went to school with were from second and third generation Pakistani and Muslim backgrounds. But our school used to run a Christian assembly and a Muslim assembly each week. I went to an inner city church in Bradford, in a church called Tunbridge Wells Mission, which is sort of in the Manningham area of Bradford. I was part of the youth uniformed organisation, the Boys Brigade, sort of an equivalent to the Scouts, but with a more evangelical take. We used to have our every so often we'd have our Boys and Girls Brigade parades. We marched through a bit of Bradford, started on a road called Drummond Road. We used to start in that kind of area, march down through there. Now, Drummond Road was infamous at that time because there was a school there that had been picketed because its headmaster had written an article talking about the impact of a school being dominated by a non-white, and by a Muslim kind of majority. And he'd written that in a right-wing magazine, and really, understandably, deeply offended the community around his school. Even if there may have been things that he said that were worth listening to, I think there are also questions about how that was going to be heard. And the school was picketed and boycotted. It's the area of the city where there were significant riots at different times, whilst at the same time being the home to my beloved football team, Bradford City, the Bantams. So that was really an area where the majority of the population would be Pakistani background, and that was our situation. And then I lived in the southeast in Medway Town, which would be majority white. You wouldn't see very many people from other ethnic backgrounds at all. Was then in London, went to trained at Oak Hill Theological College, went to a Baptist church which had become really black majority. That was where my first year student placement was. Spent a lot of my time helping with the youth work with a group of Afro-Caribbean and African teenagers. Was supervised by a senior pastor who was from an African background and has in fact written African perspective theology. And then we moved up to the West Midlands, and I pastored a church in a multi-ethnic area where we saw lots of people from different backgrounds. We planted a Spanish-speaking church with a lot of people from South America that were part of it, as well as people from all other different backgrounds as well. We didn't want it to be monocultural. And we spent a lot of time with asylum seekers. I heard their stories, walked alongside them, sought to advocate for them. That was my experience. I've also mentioned elsewhere that, in fact, although I sit here as very much a white British middle class guy, middle class and middle aged, that's not my family roots. So my great grandfather was part of an Italian immigrant community in London, sort of Clerkenwell area, was a barber, and part of a community that worked mainly in the munitions factories. Apparently on one side of the family, there's also Germanic heritage. I know even less about that than I do about the Italian heritage. I've done much about the Italian heritage. My grandpa, my mum's dad, was from Northern Ireland and joined the forces and moved around and eventually settled in England and in Bradford. That's where my mum was. So there's heritage of people sort of moving within the United Kingdom from slightly different cultural backgrounds and people coming from outside of the United Kingdom with different heritage, language and backgrounds. So I'm not that English, and I think it's always that sort of reflection, isn't it? That's the history of the United Kingdom, that people have come from all over and sort of mixed in. And so how do you claim to be the indigenous population when there's so many different backgrounds coming in. We could never claim to have been the indigenous people of Bradford. My mum had moved there, um, but there would have been people whose families would have been there before or at the same time as my mum and dad moved there, that were considered non-indigenous because of their names, because of their skin pigmentation, because of their accents and their language. That's fascinating, and that's a bit of background there, and that probably gives you a feel for where I stand on the immigration issue. My personal take is I am relaxed about immigration. I think there can be challenges to a society when you see mass immigration coming in, but I think there are also positives as well. And I lean centre right in my politics, but that means that politically my centre right thinking is of the tradition of believing in free trade, which requires free movement of goods and services and money. By implication, should also mean freedom of movement for people as well. So the assumption that if you are on the left, you must be pro-immigration, and on the right, anti-immigration is something worth testing and checking up on. And in fact, it is worth saying that when you look at the original sort of moves to leave the EU, the kind of the original sort of Brexit, the original sort of UKIP guys, it was very much not about immigration. But I think it really became an immigration issue when the people that were passionate about leaving the European Union, about Brexit, realised that there was never going to be a sort of a majority movement for things like democratic deficit or economic freedom or those kinds of things. And all this sort of principle of sovereignty, the sovereignty of Parliament and that kind of thing. But when they brought the immigration question in, that suddenly made this a much more of a populist movement. Well, all of that is kind of some background there. But the reason I wanted to pick up on this was back in the summer, you may remember that there was this horrific incident of murder in Southport, this knife attack. It was horrendous, it was tragic, and it was evil. Rumours started going round that the person who had committed this atrocity was a recent asylum seeker, someone who'd come on the boats, and also probably that they were Islamic, that they were being radicalized, and that was what it was about. And that was the rumour that went around and was even entertained by people in the public eye, politicians and news commentators. Now, actually, none of that was the case. The guy was part of a family that had been settled. In fact, I think there was sort of a Christian background. To what extent, I can't remember offhand now, but not a radicalised Islamist, and not somebody who had recently come here claiming asylum. But you may remember that seemed to be the trigger point, the spark point for riots that went across the country. That fascinatingly, whilst there was fear, there was nervousness here in places like Bradford, where I grew up, here in Birmingham, in non-white communities. Primarily, what you saw was that the riots were not taking place in the areas where there was high levels of immigration, where there was a significant ethnic influx. It seemed to be in those areas that would have been primarily white, working class, where there would have been a sense of feeling of being left behind. those areas that had voted Brexit, I think would be fair to say as well. So you remember all of that. The Prime Minister claimed that this has all been sort of driven by a far right agenda. I've written on favourites. I don't think that was helpful for him to say that. I think that gave too much credence to the far right, to fascists. I think it also enabled our media to safely attack the motives and the reasons for the riots, because fascism and the far right is something that is itself seen as foreign, a bit European, isn't it? Not very British, just vulgar and not the kind of thing we do. Whilst those same tabloid newspapers that criticised the riots are the same newspapers that have been really sort of stoking up fear around immigration and asylum seekers and pushing the kind of the stop the boats agenda. Well, I wrote some things about it. I think other Christians wrote some things as well. There wasn't anything I saw that was particularly big on that. I think some politicians started to talk about the importance, and have been talking a while. I think going back in the election, I think this was something that came through with Reform UK. There's kind of this sense of a British Christian culture being under attack and being at risk. But then I saw an article posted by Christian Concern. Now, Christian Concern started out life as Christian Concern for Our Nation, and it was an offshoot originally of the Lawyers Christian Fellowship, something to both campaign for on ethical issues where there were legal challenges to Christians, and also to provide legal backing for Christians, street preachers that have been arrested, Christians that have felt under pressure in terms of life and death decisions in hospital treatment and those kinds of things. So issues about free speech, that's where they've been involved. And Christian Concern put an article out which responded to the riots. Well, first of all, I guess in a healthy way, saying that we want to pray, that we say that there's no excuse for violence as well. We want to see that cease. But then went on to say that they believed that the riots were God's judgment. That this was something where God was trying to wake us up, and that there was a judgment, and we are being judged as a nation, and this is an example of it. And then, and this is what concerned me, because this arose out of this kind of, there's God's judgment, there's been a prophetic type warnings to the people, something that Christian Concern would seem to be saying they would identify with being the ones making those kind of warnings. And then they went on to say that one of the things, in fact, this is the big thing that gets mentioned, that they had been warning about was the danger of large-scale, uncontrolled immigration. And you began to trace that back and see that seemed to play into a bigger message, which I'm going to come back to in our final video. But the bigger message seemed to be that there had been this sense of this being a Christian nation, of a Christian culture with Christian values, and that it was being undermined. And the implication was that it was being undermined, that the Christian culture was being undermined by immigration, and by those immigrants not being integrated in and sort of assimilated into that culture. Well, I think it's worth reflecting on a couple of things here. First of all, I think we've got to ask the question: are those claims true or not? And there's a there's a few aspects to that. I think the first thing to consider is about where the immigrants, the asylum seekers, are coming from. Um, there's a couple of things. First of all, when it comes to immigration, illegal immigration, actually, those that come as asylum seekers are actually a small proportion of those that come as immigrants. And those that have come on the boats across the channel, although there's large numbers, would be a smaller proportion still. That most immigration we see comes through legal routes, and it's about people coming to work. A lot of the figures seem to be about people coming to study. I'm not sure that is actually a helpful classification for immigration. Families coming as well, people coming to marry, people coming to accompany husbands, wives, children. It's all legal. Secondly, there are significant proportions of people that have come into the United Kingdom, and their religious background would be that they would be Muslim. Um, we will just peg that for a moment. The first thing to say, though, is this: that actually large proportions of those that have come into the United Kingdom in recent years have come from Christian backgrounds. In fact, from cultures that would be more devoutly Christian than we would see here. So the Windrush generation, many of the people that came in the Windrush generation from the African Caribbean islands, from Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, were believers. Not just culturally Christian, but were believers, and that's brought a rich heritage into our country. Sadly, a lot of them found that church doors were closed to them. Others found that whilst the doors were open, that they found it hard to settle in because to integrate these things to be both ways, unless it is assimilation in, and there just wasn't a sort of a crossing over, a meeting over of minds and hearts and cultures in terms of how do we do church. What is our worship like? What's our preaching style? Those kinds of things. And so we saw a lot of black majority churches develop, but not exclusively. Lots of Afro-Caribbeans settled in existing churches here and were fantastic, and their families have stayed. And certainly, my life has been personally blessed by the Afro-Caribbean culture coming in, going back to growing up at Sunbury Road Mission in Bradford, and people that I saw as aunties and uncles that were there, that came on holiday with us, my godmother, all that kind of background, and then pastor in a church where some of the toughest moments we got through because we had the backing of a couple that had come with that Windrush generation, and they were a blessing to us. And then you see a lot of Africans, the South Americans I mentioned, coming in. Eastern Europeans will be coming with a Catholic heritage, particularly from Poland. And you've seen that where there's a growth of the church in London, it's become clear that growth is happening often because of immigration from Africa. Churches are growing, new churches are being planted. And I've had the privilege of meeting a Nigerian pastor who comes over to encourage the Nigerian diaspora, to say to them, if you're in the United Kingdom, you're here with a purpose. It's to see this country return to the gospel. It's to preach the good news. It's to see the church grow. It's to see those Christian values re-established. So in terms of who is coming, it's a bit more complex than to assume it's people coming with this kind of this alien culture. Remember that a lot of them are coming in from the Commonwealth, which is the previous British Empire. So also there would have already been some contact points between culture anyway. And I think it's fair to say as well, remember that we can overemphasize cultural differences and miss the similarities that are there because we feed off of stereotypes that are intended to encourage a sense of division. That actually, as an MP once said, we have more in common. And as a Christian, I'm very clear that I believe that Muslims need Jesus. But I also find that as I get to know Muslims one-to-one, and there are those with the kind of the radicalized agenda, but there are also so many who want to be part of a society, want to have freedom. I've seen the worst ends of Islamism, and have actually, even if they have not come because they are religious refugees because they've changed faith, also don't want the extremes, for example, of the Iranian kind of theocracy. But so many friendships that I've built up with over the years, people I've got to know, there's been that sense of the kind of values that people talk about when they talk about Christian cultural values are actually the same. Because in the end, it's not about Christian culture; it's about the gospel, isn't it? That's the distinctive thing. So you actually find that they care about the rule of law. They care about family life, often with a stronger sense of family and community than we have at times seen in a liberal, individualistic West. About honour and respect, about doing the right thing, about things like the right to life, about things like faithfulness in marriage. So it's a little bit more complex, isn't it? The other thing to say is that the history is a bit more complex because, yes, I think it is true that when you see the church grow and when you see Christians, people becoming Christians or Christians getting into places of influence, that is going to shape the culture. And there's an element to things where actually much of not just British culture but Western culture has those kind of Christian foundations. That's the thesis of Tom Holland in his book Dominion. It's the same thesis that Glenn Scrivener picks up in The Air We Breathe, isn't it? But also, because we live in a fallen world, there is much to that Western culture that has nothing to do with Christianity and in fact is anti-Christian. So here's the question. Where is this anti-immigration agenda coming from? Are those that are pro or supportive of welcoming to immigrants and immigration, are they selling out to a left-wing agenda? Or are they not? Because it seems to me that there isn't a biblical basis for arguing one way or the other about immigration and controlled immigration. If there's anything, there's a biblical basis for welcoming the stranger, the asylum seeker, the sojourner in your midst. There's a biblical basis for the people in a country being ethnically mixed. But primarily, Scripture is not dealing with how nation states today should should exist. It's about how God's people should exist. And so the concern, when there are concerns in the Bible, are not about ethnic distinctions, but about whether or not people trust in the living God or worship idols. But if there is a kind of a political agenda that seems to underpin things, then actually it is a right-wing political agenda rather than a left-wing political agenda. And that seems to be what we see as the thread running through this, that you see the same people and the same organisations taking the same sides on different things. And my argument has been that actually we've got people that are as much pushing a political agenda which comes from the right as there are people pushing an agenda from the left. And that's not a biblical agenda. It's a right-wing political agenda, which may or may not be right. In some cases, I would have sympathies with some of those things that come from the right. In other cases, immigration. I would not. Now, I do believe that there is some theology here, that it isn't as simple as we've just tried to just impose a political agenda in. There's a bit of sort of cross-fertilization, that there's a theology that is both fed by and feeds that particular political perspective. But it is a specific theological interpretation. That's not the same as saying it's biblical, it's God's word. And in fact, I would disagree significantly with that particular theology. The theology we're talking about is in terms of eschatology, it's post-millennial. In terms of its understanding of how God is at work now, there's this big sense that it is beyond making disciples, to the sense that actually the church and God's people should be extending God's reign through political means. At one extreme, and I think there is a range of views here, there would be this understanding of theonomy. I can't even say that word. And so there's an influence of those that are saying that the government itself should be Christian. And that's the direction we should be heading towards. Now, I don't think that everybody who is making the types of arguments I've talked about would be signed up fully to that theonomist, really can't get that word, agenda, or even be necessarily aware of it. Like I said, there'll be a spectrum. But I think that is the kind of influence, similarly the post-millennialism. But I think that's where the influences are coming in. And later on we'll try and trace that out a bit more. Well, thanks for listening in today. Hope that this has stimulated some thoughts, maybe encouraged some discussion between you and others. Please do drop comments in to give feedback. Thank you.